You're listening to the Life Edit Project podcast, where busy, ambitious high achievers get the tools they need to fight overwhelm and overthinking with balance, self-mastery, and a positive mindset. I'm your host, Elizabeth Burrows. I'm serving up bite-sized truth bombs in a judgment-free zone based on my perspective as a life coach, wife, mom, and recovering overachiever. We keep it real over here, which usually means some combination of insightful, entertaining, and a hot mess express. So, if you're looking for perfection, look elsewhere. But if you're still with me, let's dig into this week's episode. Good day, good people. Welcome to episode 2 of the Life Edit Project podcast. You know, it's funny, when I recorded episode 1, I was referring to it as episode 0 throughout the podcast. And you may have caught that. And the reason is because I was just thinking of that episode as an introduction. And I was telling myself that it didn't really count as an episode. Then the week before I launched, I was speaking with a business colleague of mine that happens to be a podcast manager. And I told her what I was doing. And I told her how I had planned out, this whole podcast. And I was getting ready to launch. And I had the first season all planned. And I mentioned to her what episode 0 was going to be about. And she just kind of gave me this look, and she got this really deadpan look on her face, and she stopped me and she said, "There's no such thing as episode 0. It's not a thing." And I looked at her and I was trying to convince her and change her mind, because I was like, "Oh, no, maybe you just don't get it." And she said, "No, there's no such thing as episode 0. It's episode 1. And of course I had already recorded the episode and I decided not to re-record it. I was just going to let it fly. So anyways, that was funny. But the other thing that's also happened is that since episode 1 dropped, I've already gotten some amazing feedback from people that I really like and respect. And actually, the day episode 1 dropped, 2 different friends of mine reached out to me telling me that them hearing my story of how my childhood set me up to become a chronic overachiever immediately changed their perspective on parenting and the way that they relate to their young daughters. And I'm floored. I just didn't see that coming. And so the lesson for me is just that it all counts. Everything counts. Even the things that we think are minor can have unexpectedly huge impacts. So let's stop discounting the value we bring to those who cross our paths. Okay, so that's the pep talk for the day. And if you haven't yet had a chance to listen to episode 1, definitely add it to your playlist and give it a listen when you have a few moments, because it's good and it's juicy. But since you're already here for episode 2, let's just go ahead and dig into today's topic, okay? Because I have a banger of an episode here for you today. Today, we are talking about Superwoman Syndrome. Why? Because it's a real challenge for so many women, and it has real impact on so many of our lives. But even though so many women can identify with the concept of Superwoman Syndrome, most of us don't actually have the language or the context to call it out in our lives or to address it. And if we're going to talk about editing our lives, hint, that's what this podcast is all about, Superwoman Syndrome is high on the list of things that I recommend every woman should work to delete, or at least decrease. And it'll become clear why I feel this way before we reach the end of the episode. So let me fill you in on the basics of Superwoman Syndrome so that you can recognize it and ultimately neutralize it in your own life. So what is Superwoman Syndrome? The first thing I want to make clear is that Superwoman Syndrome is very official sounding because it is called a syndrome, but it's not actually a medical diagnosis or an official mental or psychiatric or even psychological condition, right? It's not. However, it is a term that has been floating around the personal development and mental health space since the mid 1980s. But now, okay, because it's not an official syndrome, you can find a whole plethora of definitions for Superwoman Syndrome out there on the interwebs if you wanted to do a search for them. And what you'll find is that most of those definitions refer to the pressure that comes with women trying to juggle the demands of the competing roles that come with trying to live a modern life as a woman. I mean, that's really what most of those definitions speak to. However, because it's me, I don't feel like those definitions and that perspective really gets to the heart of the matter. I find that just taking that perspective, it's missing some of the nuance, some of the zhuzh, and it doesn't fully capture the impact that Superwoman Syndrome actually has on us as women. So I'm going to give you the Coach Elizabeth definition, which you will find in absolutely nobody's dictionary because it came from my own brain. Okay. Now, P.S., if you become a regular listener of this podcast, and I hope you will, this is not going to be the last time you hear me giving my own unique definition of an existing concept. I do this all the time, partly because I am taking a different perspective than kind of what's already out there, but also partly because I just really want to be clear and I really want you to understand. I want you to know exactly what I mean when I use these terms and when I refer to these concepts. So, okay, here we go. In the Coach Elizabeth definition of Superwoman Syndrome, it is a behavioral pattern of hyper-performing beyond what is reasonable and sustainable. I'm going to say it again in case you missed it. The Coach Elizabeth definition of Superwoman Syndrome is that it is a behavioral pattern of hyper-performing beyond what is reasonable and sustainable. Think overachieving, overworking, and overcommitting. Okay? Now, Superwoman Syndrome is going to show up differently in different people, in part because we all have our own unique sets of skills, talents. We have different capacities and experiences. We have different knowledge and resources. And because we each occupy unique roles in our families, communities, and within society as a whole, right? So Superwoman Syndrome is not a one-size-fits-all pattern. Still, I believe we can identify it when it shows up because we'll see some of the same characteristics over and over. And let me give you some examples. So overworking is one of the characteristics that will come up over and over again for Superwoman Syndrome. And when I say overworking, that can look like doing all the things all the time or almost all the time. It can also look like going the extra mile when you're completing tasks. If this is you probably have a hard time not using every sliver of time available to you to do something productive. Yeah. Another characteristic of Superwoman Syndrome is overcommitting. Overcommitting can look like saying yes to obligations despite not having the time, energy, resources, or bandwidth to fulfill them. If this is hurting your feelings, if you feel called out, if you feel convicted and seen, I'm not trying to call you out. I'm just telling it like it is. So don't take it personal. Another characteristic of Superwoman Syndrome is what I'm going to call being overly responsible or hyper responsible. That looks like taking responsibility for other people's actions or results, as well as claiming responsibility for things that are outside of your natural control. And a fourth characteristic that I've identified with Superwoman Syndrome is overachieving. And of course, I talked a lot about overachieving in the last episode of this podcast. But let me kind of put more of a clear definition around overachieving or examples. Overachieving can look like always striving to be in the upper echelon of success, no matter what the measuring stick is. So we're not just passing the test, we're acing it. We're not just running the race, we're going to snag a medal. We're not just getting promoted, we're setting a record as being the youngest person to ever hold this position, etc. Now, If these 4 types of hyper-performing were the only things that characterize Superwoman Syndrome, it might not be such a bad thing. I mean, because overworking, overcommitting, being overly responsible, overachieving, it doesn't sound that bad, right? It doesn't sound harmful, right? And it can be really seductive to think of ourselves as being the kind of person that gets things done, the kind of person that people can rely on, or the kind of person that takes care of everything and everyone around her. But the true problem with Superwoman Syndrome is that in addition to hyper-performing, it is also characterized by self-neglect. Always, no exceptions, period. And you don't even have to be hyper-performing in all of the 4 ways that I described, right? The overworking, overcommitting, hyper-responsibility, and overachieving. You don't have to cross all 4 of those things off the Superwoman Syndrome list to say, yeah, this sounds like me. You could just be displaying 2 of the 4 characteristics. But no matter how you're hyper-performing, you're also going to be executing at the expense of your own physical, mental, emotional, or even financial well-being. You're taking care of everything except yourself because you are not the priority. Performing in your role is the priority. And now this gets really layered because self-neglect in the context of Superwoman Syndrome is also not a one-size-fits-all kind of situation. There are all kinds of creative ways to sacrifice yourself in the name of success. And let me give you some more examples of what self-neglect can look like. It can look like resisting help. So this includes not asking for help when you need it, not accepting help when it's offered, and even setting arbitrary terms for what kind of help is acceptable. Again, if you feel called out, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings. I am just trying to call your attention to this so that you can do something about it. Another form of self-neglect is suppressing emotions. And this one is sneakier because it's not always obvious, but suppressing emotions, it can include not allowing yourself to feel negative or uncomfortable feelings, but it might also include stopping yourself from expressing any kind of intense emotion, whether it's positive or negative. Suppressing emotions might also include disassociating so that you don't even have to feel anything, right? Just completely being separate from your feelings. And I call that a form of self-neglect because our emotions, our feelings are an integral part of us and an integral part of how we experience life. And when you are living in resistance of your feelings, you are neglecting yourself. Another form of self-neglect is ignoring your physical necessities. Okay, now I'm going to raise my hand on this because this has been my ongoing challenge over the years. So ignoring your physical necessities is exactly what it sounds like. It might look like not getting enough sleep, skipping meals, avoiding doctor appointments, overindulging in unhealthy habits. It might even look like something like over-exercising, right? Taking something that in moderation is good for you, but taking it to an extreme so that it causes you harm. So many ways to neglect ourselves, ladies. Another form of self-neglect is overextending your finances. So if you are a hyper-responsible person, chances are you might be overcommitting or taking responsibility for others, right? And if that's the case, this might impact you financially because you might be doing things like regularly paying bills that aren't yours, or lending money to friends and family that never gets repaid, or even buying gifts that you can't afford, or prioritizing funding requests from others in lieu of funding your own financial goals. Yeah, that is overextending your finances, and that is self-neglect. The last type of self-neglect I'm going to mention on this podcast episode is social isolation. Now, this one is also subtle and sneaky because I don't just mean like locking yourself in a dark closet and never coming out and not socializing. What I mean when I say social isolation is disconnecting from more beneficial and high quality relationships in order to make room for less beneficial, lower quality, and less fulfilling relationships. That is a form of social isolation, and it is also a form of self-neglect. Now, when we focus on the hyper-performance part of Superwoman Syndrome, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we can just perform our way out of the problem. We can convince ourselves that we can just do better. We can be more organized, or we can be more motivated, or we can be more proactive. We can be more productive, right? And if we were just more of all of those things, then we wouldn't have a problem. But when we start trying to perform our way out of the problem, the self-neglect aspect that is always present with Superwoman Syndrome, it only aggravates and magnifies whatever the problem is. When you're struggling with Superwoman Syndrome, winning more, doing more, means losing more of yourself. And the worst part of all of it is that Superwoman Syndrome is also characterized by the undercurrent of perfectionism. Y'all, Superwoman Syndrome is so insidious. So we're all highly intolerant of anything that we perceive to be weakness, idleness, vulnerability, or mediocrity. So we hold ourselves to impossible standards that we can't meet, and we run ourselves ragged trying to measure up to these impossible standards. And as we run ourselves ragged, it makes us less capable of reaching success. And so we make mistakes and we put out work that is subpar, or maybe we just fail altogether. And then we judge ourselves for the perceived failure or for the mistakes. And then we punish ourselves by doubling down on the impossible standards. And it becomes a vicious cycle. Ask me how I know. Been there, done that. One day I'm going to write a book about it, but for right now, you're going to get this podcast. So, what do we do about all of this? Now that we have a better idea of what the real problem is with Superwoman Syndrome, how do we solve for it? Well, I have good news and bad news, and then some more good news. So the first bit of good news is that the solution to Superwoman Syndrome is simple, and it's available to you no matter who you are. So the solution to Superwoman Syndrome is just the opposite of all of the traits and characteristics that I listed for you earlier in this episode. So instead of overworking, we're going to reach for sufficiency. Instead of overachieving, we're also going to reach for sufficiency and gratitude. Instead of overcommitting, we're going to reach for healthy boundaries. Instead of hyper-responsibility, we're going to reach for genuine accountability. Instead of self-neglect, we're going to work towards self-care. And instead of perfectionism, we're going to reach for excellence and self-compassion. Simple, right? But the bad news is that it's hard. Doing this work is hard. Showing up differently than the way you're used to showing up in life is hard. And there is no way around that. That is the bad news. It's going to take time, and get this, it's going to take imperfect implementation. And because Superwoman Syndrome has this undercurrent of perfectionism, and the process of getting through it and getting past it requires imperfect implementation, you trying to get out of it is actually going to cause your Superwoman Syndrome to flare up. The imperfect implementation, the imperfect action that you take, it is going to make your perfectionism muscle twitch. And that's just part of the process. Nothing has gone wrong. Now, The other good news is that even though this work is hard, you don't have to do it alone. I'm here for you right here on this podcast. And in fact, a lot of the things that I'll be talking about on this podcast this season are going to tie back to this solution to Superwoman Syndrome. I've even got a little mini series planned on some different elements of self-care, and that's going to be a super fun series of conversations. And we're going to talk about things like how to use tools like boundaries and accountability to just edit the crap right out of your life. And the best part is that none of these conversations are going to be boring. I'm going to keep it all the way real with you, and we're going to talk about real, messy life situations and circumstances. It's going to be both entertaining and enlightening, and it might just change your life. So, stay tuned all season long. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so that you never miss an episode. And of course, if this episode was helpful to you, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd share it with your friends. You can, text the link directly to somebody that you think would like to hear it. You can share it on your social media and your stories. And if you do that, please be sure to tag me at Life Edit Project, all one word. And just sharing it out will help make sure that this message reaches more people. And trust me, more people need to hear this. And if having me in your ears on this podcast isn't enough for you, you can also work directly with me by signing up for my one-on-one coaching program. In working with me one-on-one, you'll get a private coaching session each week for 6 months with me. We'll do it virtually, by Zoom or by phone, so that you can get customized support to deal with whatever it is that life is throwing at you, including Superwoman Syndrome. If you want to book a call with me to talk about one-on-one coaching, you can find the link to do that in the show notes. So just tap that link and it'll take you right there. Otherwise, I'll be back with more juicy goodness for you in a fresh episode next week. Take care. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Life Edit Project podcast. I'd love to hear what your favorite moment or key takeaway was from this conversation. You can send me a message on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter to let me know. My handle is at Life Edit Project, all one word, in all the places. My social media is linked up in the show notes to make it easy for you. Holla at your girl. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, don't just stay busy with the life you have. Get busy creating the life you want.